Right, hello everybody, welcome along again. Here we are with part 12 of the Attenborough readings that we're doing as part of your tutor reading for school. I'm going to continue reading very shortly. As a quick recap, in case you've had a break between your viewings, David Attenborough is out adventuring in Guyana. They're in the middle of nowhere. They've been dropped off in a remote tribal village for a week and are doing some filming, but they're also, as the title of this chapter suggests, going to encounter sloths and snakes. In the previous readings, we've encountered the sloths. It's now time to watch out for the snakes. He's also describing and recording some of the activities of the local native people. So let's read on. The main occupation of the women was the making of cassava bread, thin, flat cakes of which lay drying in the sun on the roofs of the houses and on special racks. They grew the cassava in plots between the village and the river. We filmed the women as they dug up the tall plants and removed the starchy tubers from among the roots. Tubers are a bit like potatoes, the way they grow underground. That's what they mean, so that's cassava. These they peeled and grated on a board and studded with sharp fragments of stone. The juice of cassava contains a lethal poison, prussic acid, and to remove it, a woman loaded the soggy, grated cassava onto a matapee, a 6-foot tube of extendable basket work closed at one end with loops at the top and the bottom. When it was full, she hung the matapee on a projecting beam of a hut. She passed a pole through the bottom loop and attached it to a rope tied to the hut post. Then she sat on the free end of the pole, and the laden matapee, squat and fat, stretched so that it became long and thin. In doing so, it squeezed the cassava, and the poisonous juice trickled out at the bottom. So which is described there as quite an ingenious way of basically squeezing the poisonous liquid out of the food. And in fact, here we go, is a picture illustrating just that, as it says, squeezing out the poisonous juice from the grated cassava. So you might just be able to see, like she's got this long pole and is always squeezing it out. Very clever, very clever. Straightforward, but that it works, and that's the important thing. Right, we move on. The dry cassava was then sieved and baked. Some of the women used a flattened stone, but others employed a cast iron circular plate, exactly the same as is used in Wales and Scotland in making girdle cakes. The flat disc of the cassava bread, having been cooked on both sides, was put outside to dry. We had been watching the process when Clarence came into the hut at a run. Clarence is one of the locals, remember. "Quick, quick! David!" he yelled, waving his arms wildly. "I find ting for you to catch!" I ran after him to a log lying in a patch of low scrub close to this hut. But by the side of it I saw a small black snake, about 18 inches long, slowly swallowing a lizard. "Quick, quick, you catch him!" Clarence cried enthusiastically. "Well, I think we should film him first," I said, procrastinating, which is like putting something off, procrastinating. "Charles, come quickly." The snake, unconcerned by all the excitement, continued with its meal. The head and shoulders of the lizard had already disappeared, and we could just see the tips of its front toes pressed against its body, projecting out of the corners of the snake's mouth. In girth, which is like width, the snake was about a third of the size of the lizard, so to accommodate its enormous meal, the snake had unhinged its lower jaw. Even so, its little black eyes almost popped out of its head. "Hey," called Clarence to the world at large, "David, he going to catch this bad snake." "Is this a very bad one?" I asked Clarence nervously. "I don't know," he replied with relish, "but I think he terrible bad." Meanwhile, Charles was already filming. He looked up over his camera. "I'd like to help," he said smugly, "but I must record this unique exhibition of gallantry." By now the snake had reached the hind legs of the lizard. It was not eating it so much as crawling over and around its victim, for the lizard had remained in exactly the same position relative to the ground, while the snake slowly advanced towards its victim's tail. It did this by wrinkling its body into zigzags and then stretching straight in rather the same way that one threads a cord into pyjama trousers. Most of the villagers had assembled in an expectant circle. The last tip of the lizard's tail disappeared, and the little snake, grossly distended, like fattened, began to crawl heavily away. I had no excuse for further delay. Taking a forked stick, I jabbed it down astride the snake's neck, so that the reptile was pinned to the ground. "Quick, Charles," I said, "I can't do anything more unless you're having a collecting bag." "Here's one," Charles replied cheerfully, pulling a small cotton bag from his pocket. He held it open. With great distaste I put a thumb and forefinger round the snake's neck, picked it up, and dropped the wriggling creature into the bag. I heaved a sigh of relief, and, as in a casual manner as I could manage, walked back to our hut. So he's trying to make it look like he didn't find that terrifying. Clarence and the spectators trotted behind. "Sometimes maybe we find big bushmaker snake, and then you show us how to catch that ting," he chattered enthusiastically. It was a week before I could show my capture to Jack. "Non-poisonous," he said tersely, handling it complete unconcern. "You won't mind if I let it go, will you?" he added. Just reminded that Jack is somebody from London Zoo who's there to catch some animals to take back with them. It's very common. He put it on the ground beneath a bush, as I watched it wriggling rapidly away through the undergrowth. And that's the end of that little section. So next. Late one evening, a young Akawayo boy trotted into the village. Over his shoulder he carried a blowpipe, and in his hand he held a cloth bag. "David, you want these tings?" he said shyly. I opened the mouth of the bag and peered cautiously inside. To my astonishment and delight, I saw at the bottom, lying perfectly still, several tiny hummingbirds. I shut the bag quickly and excitedly ran into our hut, where we had a cage made from... Well, I know what this cage is made from now. A cage made from... There we go. From a wooden crate, ready for any animal that might turn up. One by one I put the little birds inside. To my relief, they immediately took flight, darted rapidly through the air, hovered, and then jerkily reversed to settle on the thin perches with which the cage was fitted. I turned to the boy who had followed me. "How you catched him?" I asked. "Blowpipe and these tings," he replied, handing me a dart. Its sharp point had been tipped with a little round pellet of beeswax. I turned again to the hummingbirds. The light blow from the blunted dart had obviously only stunned them temporarily, and they were now busily flitting to and fro in the cage. One of them was a particularly beautiful creature, not more than 2 inches long, which I recognised before we left London. I had visited the Natural History Museum and been captivated by one of the most delicate and gorgeous of all the hummingbird skins there. It was labelled, now here we go with my Latin, Lephornis ornatus, the tufted coquette. What had been beautiful even as a stuffed bird was here a breathtaking spectacle of movement and exquisite colour. They really are stunning, hummingbirds, such beautiful creatures. On top of its tiny head it flaunted a short crest of vertical topaz red feathers. Beneath its needle-thin beak shone an iridescent emerald gorget, and fanning out on either cheek was a sheaf of topaz feathers flecked with spots of emerald. My absolute advice would be to pause this screen at some point and type that into Google and see what comes up so you can see it for yourself. It sounds absolutely delightful. And iridescent is one of my favourite words. I was both entranced and dismayed, for although I had hoped to see this bird more than any other, we had decided that Jack should concentrate on collecting hummingbirds at Camarang, and we had not brought any of the necessary feeding equipment with us to the village. Hummingbirds live mainly on nectar from forest flowers. In captivity, they will readily accept a solution of honey and water enriched with milk extracts. As they only feed on the wing, as in flying, special bottles with a cork at the top and a tiny spout at the bottom are needed to enable them to sip this substitute nectar. We had none of these things with us. So how are they going to do? They have to let the hummingbirds go, or they're going to find a way of feeding them. By now it was dark, and the little birds would not feed even if we had been able to offer them anything. We squatted in our hammocks and prepared a solution of sugar, hoping that it might provide them with enough sustenance. Laboriously we tried to improvise feeding bottles by boring holes in the base section of bamboo and inserting small spouts from the stem of another tree. The finished result seemed very crude, and we went to bed rather despondently, almost disappointed. We were wakened in the middle of the night by a tremendous rainstorm. The roof of the church had great gaps in it, and we were leapt out of our hammocks to shift all our equipment and the hummingbirds in their cage to a dry spot. For the remainder of the night I slept only fitfully as the rain dripped down around me and collected in puddles on the floor. My single blanket became clammier and clammier, like damper and damper. In my mind I could hear Bill saying that the seasons were deranged, that the rains might well begin early, and that once they started they might continue for days on end without any real let-up. In the morning, with the rain still drumming on the roof and pattering on the floorboards of the hut, we did our best to persuade the hummingbirds to feed from our improvised bottles. We had no success. Our substitute equipment was altogether too crude, and the sugar solution rapidly dripped out of the bottle before the birds had taken any. We knew that they had to feed several times a day, and that without regular supplies they would be quickly wilt and die, like flowers without water. With a wrench we made the decision to release them, but having done so, a weight lifted from our minds as the fragile things flew off through the door of our hut straight to the forest. I sat in the doorway of the hut and brooded while Charles busied himself among the stores and the equipment. Outside I could see the village through the squalls of rain, huddled and forlorn and desolate under the dismal sky. If this was indeed the beginning of the rainy season, all our plans for filming in the Mazaruni Basin would have to be abandoned, and all the trouble and expense of getting there would have been wasted. I thought miserably of how exultant Jack would have been to have seen the tufted coquette and the other hummingbirds we'd just released, and how foolish and short-sighted we had been not to bring any feeding bottles. Charles joined me. "I've made a few discoveries that might amuse you," he said. "First, that packet of sugar you just emptied into your tea was our last. Second, I can't find the tin opener. Third, the air is so damp that there's a great patch of fungus growing on one of the lenses of my camera. And fourth, I can't change that lens because the mounting has seized up." He looked pensively at the rain. "If there's fungus growing on the glass of the lens," he continued, "it might be sprouting like mustard cress on the exposed film. Not that it matters," he added mournfully, "because it's probably melted in the heat anyway." There was nothing for us to do but wait until the rain stopped. I returned to my hammock. Dejectedly I took out of my kit one of the few books we had brought with us, The Golden Treasury. I read for a few minutes. "Charles," I said, "have you ever felt that William Cowper, 1731 to 1800, had any particular message for you?" Charles made a vulgar but dismal reply. "You're wrong, listen," I said. "O solitude, where are the charms that sages have seen in thy face? Better dwell in the midst of alarms than reign in this horrible place." And a little poem for you to finish before we move on to the next chapter in the next part of my video, Spirits in the Night, which sounds very spooky, doesn't it? Right, well, thanks very much for joining me for this part. This is part 12. Hopefully see you soon for part 13. Bye-bye.